Since the beginning of the American history, slavery has been present in the United States as a form of economic booster. However, as time passed, some people began to realize that the slaves were being treated with injustice and began to consider their rights. Those people were called the abolitionists. The abolitionist movement was a reform to bring an end to slavery in a nation that thrived personal freedom and believed all men are created equal. In this movement, men and women were involved, as well as black and white. The movement then led to the women's rights movement and the American Colonization Society.
Men's actions throughout the abolitionist movement helped the destruction of slavery. Martin R. Delaney, who had never been a slave but knew what it meant to be one from his extensive trips to the South, introduced us to a new way for slavery to be fought. In 1850, along with two other black men, Delaney was accepted into Harvard Medical School, but was soon removed due to a successful petition done by white students. Delaney became an ardent black nationalist, as he felt that merit and reason could no longer allow members of his race to have an equal opportunity in white society. He therefore traveled to Africa and negotiated with several tribal chiefs in Abahuta for land to establish a colony for skilled and educated African Americans, but he was not able to succeed as they could not communicate properly. After his return to America and towards the end of the Civil War, Delaney became the first black officer in a general staff in the history of the U.S. Army. John Brown, a radical abolitionist, was also an influential leader in this movement. Brown killed 5 pro-slavery settlers after some of its groups attacked the town of Lawrence in 1856. This was after the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed citizens of its territories to determine whether the state would be free or not. Many from both of these factions fled to the Kansas territory and used violence in an attempt to gain supremacy. After the killings, the territory became known as the Bleeding Kansas. Years later, on the night of October 16, 1859, Brown, followed by 21 men, set out on a raid to capture the U.S. arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, present-day West Virginia.
By the 1830s, not only men were involved in the movement to abolish slavery, but women as well, as they stood to fight for their rights or the rights of others. Many were elected to the Anti-Slavery Society. This woman began combining their abolitionist interests with the fight for gender equality. The Grimrick sisters were one of those and became famous for their speeches. They spoke against slavery, but sometimes felt discriminated and inferior for being women and so began defending their rights. Even though there were many women who fought in the abolitionist movement, such as Sarah Douglas, Maria Miller W. Stewart, Lucretia Mott, and Maria Weston Chapman, the most well-known are the 2 escaped slaves, Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. Sojourner Truth was both an abolitionist and a feminist. She began speaking to large crowds on slavery and human rights, and in 1851 she delivered her most famous speech on the Women's Rights Convention. Also, during the Civil War, she helped look for black troops for the Union Army. Truth later argued the ownership of private property that would provide African Americans self-sufficiency and free them from wealthy landowners. Harriet Tubman opposed slavery from a young age. When she was 25, she ran away through the Underground Railroad. She went north but traveled frequently to the south to help others escape. She was able to free 300 slaves. The price for her capture rose, but Tubman was never caught. Both of these women were fearless as they stood up not only for their rights, but to the fight against slavery. The abolitionist movement was instrumental in creating long-lasting influences that helped America to develop a more tolerant society. For example, as slavery had finally come to an end, the women began to feel marginalized and started to question their own rights, leading to the development of women's rights movement. The early women abolitionists began their fight for slavery by joining anti-slavery groups where they learned to organize and articulate a public protest. However, slavery also opposed women from taking active roles in the abolitionist movement. As they became aware of that, women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott decided to hold the first Women's Rights Convention in 1848. In the convention, abolitionist women actively called for attention to unfair treatment of women.